Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are. I don't know what the equivalent of prendial is for after lunch, but I'm sure someone will tell me. But whatever it is, I hope you are all it. So there's a bit of a, I don't know whether to do this gag, but we'll start off and see how it goes. This is a bit of a bad news, good news story with this presentation. The bad news is that it was originally a 45-minute slot. The good news is I got it widened to 60. The bad news is that I did it yesterday and it took an hour and 45. The good news is that I did a bit of noodling with a PowerPoint last night and cut it down a little bit. That's good news. The bad news is it now might take 20 minutes. The good news is we've got Chad Church from SyncFusion following me, and they've got some cool stuff, so maybe he can pad it out a little bit. But anyway, so I was asked to give a presentation about the Windows Presentation Foundation and how you might be able to use that from Dyalog APL. And then Morton, some time ago, had an idea. He sort of said, you know what, we really need to do something about data binding. So I went off and looked a little bit into data binding, and then I sort of hijacked this presentation. It is predominantly about WPF, but the more you find out about WPF and data binding, you realize that really the uber coolness of the stuff comes from doing the two things together. So what we're going to see today is some WPF stuff, but tightly integrated with the data binding, because it blew my mind when I saw what you could do with this stuff. So let me just tell you first of all what WPF is. It's an acronym, no it isn't. It means Windows Presentation Foundation. So it's a new framework for designing GUI for Windows. Now how that compares with QuadWC, here for example we have some QuadWC code which, I don't know whether you can see, my eyes aren't as young as they were, but what we have here is we set our coordinate system to pixel just so that there's some consistency between this stuff and the WPF stuff. We create a form, we create an edit field, we create a list box called all, and we create a list box called filtered. And that generates a UI that looks a little bit like this. But we've had to be very careful about where we've positioned everything so that things line up against each other and so on. If we want to write a similar UI in WPF, the situation is quite different. Let me get back up here. And we can do it in a couple of ways, but by far I think the easiest way to do it, and by far the way that most examples online show you how to do this stuff, is through XAML, this application markup language, which looks like XML. And here is the XML that generates the same UI that we saw with QuadWC. And let me break this down a little bit and show you what's going on. First of all, at the top and at the bottom, at the top we have an open tag for something called window. And this says that what we are defining here is a window and its contents. And we have some stuff at the top so that the underlying .NET framework knows which particular instance, which particular window class we're talking about. And because this is XML, at the bottom we have a closing tag for our window object. And then inside this bit of XML, I can now define something called a stack panel. And inside that, I can have a text box, okay, which will be this guy that appears here. And then I can define a wrap panel. Inside that, I have a list box and a list box. Okay, now a wrap panel is essentially something that by default lines things up horizontally next to each other. So in this wrap panel here, we have our two list boxes, and I've specified a little margin here of 5 pixels, which gives me a uniform gap around each of those items. And the stack panel then arranges things by default vertically. So in my stack panel, I have my edit field at the top, and then I have the wrap panel underneath. So we have that combination of horizontal and vertical alignments. And you'll notice that in this code, though, at no point do we specify the position of anything. Okay, we specify how big we want things to be, and we specify where they are to appear in relation to each other, but we never say specifically where something should be. And that takes a lot of complication away from us when we're designing UIs and writing UIs. We've all written code with QuadWC where we think, oh, I've got to move this window, now I've got to percolate that size down through all the other child members. One of the big advantages of WPF is the way these flow controls work. We don't need to worry about that precise positioning of things. You can, of course, define these WPF components in code, and this is the quad new .NET-y sort of stuff that you would use to define the same user interface that I just showed you with the XAML. Now, I've cheated a little bit because one of these is syntax colored and the other isn't. But I think, certainly from my perspective, this is a much cleaner way of looking at something than looking at a bunch of quad news. I got into a bit of trouble yesterday for saying that this is code because it's stuff that does stuff, and that this isn't code because this is just a declaration of what your user interface is. Got into a bit of trouble about describing them like that yesterday. So today I'll describe this as APL code, by which I mean stuff that does stuff. Okay, and this is XAML. I may occasionally say XAML code. I may just say XAML. But it defines what the interface is. So this does stuff, and this tells you what stuff is. It's a bit of a grey area, but forgive me that that little thought process there. So that creates the same GUI with quad new stuff. The advantage of XAML is, for example, if I want to add a new text box into my layout, if I put it in my stack panel right at the top before the first text box, then what happens is it appears there, and we've not had to change any of the other layout. The other edit boxes automatically move down because the stack panel knows the order in which these things should be displayed. One other layout tool that's very important in WPF is this thing called a grid. Now, this isn't to be confused with the APL grid that we have, which is designed to display data. This is a layout tool which is designed to allow you to lay out your controls and your content horizontally and vertically at the same time. Stack panels go vertically, wrap panels go horizontally. Sort of grid, rather simplistically thinking, allows you to do things in two directions. So in the XAML for a grid, we again have our window, top and bottom. We have a declaration, an open tag for a grid and a closed tag for a grid. We define some rows with heights. We design some columns with widths. We define 1, 2, 3, 4 elements. And on each of these, we specified which grid row and grid column they appear in. And that generates a little UI there where we have edit fields in the left-hand column and buttons in the right-hand column. And it's all done with this declarative stuff that tells me what my interface looks like, what my interface is. Now let's come on to data binding because it's awesome. Okay, it is used so much in the samples that you see online for WPF that it would be it would be criminal not to demonstrate it now in this context, and it would be criminal not to have done this 2-3 years ago. Let me show you the sorts of problems that WPF can help you with and how it can help you tidy up your code. Here's a user interface and I'll show you the quad WC for this in a moment, but it's that edit field and those two list boxes that we saw before. And the idea is that you type a filter into the top edit field, and the right-hand list box ends up containing those names in the left that contain those characters in that sequence. And this is a list of names of Dyalog employees. In quad WC, we call a function called quad WC which creates the user interface, and we saw that before. And then we need to associate a callback. Unfortunately, with quad WC, we need to associate that callback with the key press event because of the way the quad WC stuff works. We can't put it on an event when the text changes because, for historical reasons, that isn't how it works. And then here, in Dyalog quad WC, we can assign the items property of the left-hand list box, which is called all, with a global variable, which is a nested array of names. And then when the user types into that edit field, we have a little callback, which needs to do a little bit of nonsense because it needs to make sure the text is finally updated. But then it can retrieve from the edit field what its current text is, use that as a filter on the names, and then assign the result of that filter to the items property of the box on the right. This isn't the best bit of APL code in the world. I think on a later PowerPoint it gets better. If we want to data bind this relationship in WPF, then we can do that, but it's worth just going through the anatomy of the thing a little bit first. If we had a list box that has, or an edit field, sorry, that has got a text property, okay, and in our workspace we have a character array. What we need to do is, from our character array, we can create a data source, and then we can bind our data source to the text property on the edit field. Similarly, if we had a nested array in our workspace, we can create a data source from that and then bind that to the item source property of the list box. But furthermore, if we have a namespace inside our workspace that contains a number of variables, we can create one data source and bind 3 different properties to those names in that namespace. And we'll see how this works as we go through. So with data binding, this is a WPF example. Here is the function that sets this up. So the first thing we do is we create our user interface, and we'll see how that is done later. That basically is just instantiating the XAML, if you like. Here what we have is oh no, wait a minute, hold on. I don't really want to show you this. Okay, this is one way of doing it. If we didn't want to use XAML, this is how we could set up our data binding between the list box on our APL workspace. Okay, but let me just skip over that, and let me show you how it works if we do it with XAML instead of with Quad News all the way through. What we can do is we can create a namespace called my source. We can call it anything we like. It's just a namespace. Inside that, we can define a variable called filter, which is an empty character array. And inside that, we can have a nested array filtered list, which originally contains no elements. And inside our source, we can have a global variable Dyalog names, which initially is just the same thing as what I have in the root of my workspace. And then I use this 2015 IBeam, which is something that is currently what we have in version 14.0, but as we go through might turn into a system function, may stay as an IBeam, we're not sure yet. But what it does is it takes our namespace and binds it up as this data source thing. We can then load our XAML with this simple function here. All this does is it takes a text array as an argument, which it contains our XAML. It passes it through a number of .NET functions, and out at the end pops an instance of the window that has the content that is described within the XAML. Okay, we then assign our result of our 2015 IBeam to this property called data context of the window. And basically what this says is that for the window, anything that wants to data bind can bind to something within that data context. So essentially, we could have a single namespace that contained all the data that this window needed, and it would all be in the one place. Okay. You can define data context lower down in your tree, but for the purposes of this, we'll just have the one data context for the entire window. And then we make our window visible. Okay. Now, in order to hook up the what happens when the edit changes the text in the edit field, in the previous example, we needed to hook an event on the edit field itself. But with data binding in WPF, we can actually hook a callback onto the data source. So what we're saying here is when something changes in the source, call this function. And what this function then does is it just has a regular APL expression that's doing nothing other than manipulating variables in a namespace. There's no reference to the GUI in here at all. Here is the XAML that creates the user interface here. And it's very much like what we saw before when we saw it before. The difference here, though, is that I've added some of these binding statements. And Morten showed one of these in his presentation this morning. Let's look at the list boxes first. What I'm saying here is that its item source property comes from a data binding, and it's bound to a thing called Dyalog names. And because we set up our data context to be that namespace called my source, this is saying that these items are tightly bound to my source.dialog names. Similarly, the right-hand list box is bound to the thing called filtered list that we saw, and the edit field is bound to a thing called filter, which was that empty character array. Now, with the edit field, we do an extra little bit of work because we want this binding to work in 2 directions. When the edit field changes, we want the variable to change so that we can then hook a callback on that. But in the other cases, it's strictly one-way binding. If the user or if the code in the UI changes the list box contents, it's not going to change our global variable. So what we have here is we have 3 components. We have the APL code that sets up our source. We have our XAML code that defines what our user interface looks like. And we have our logic, our handler for what happens when something happens in the user interface. But with this, we can sort of fade the user interface away, because what's left doesn't make references to it at all, other than just setting up the data context in the window. So that this means that from our logic point of view, when we write our program, we don't care what the user interface looks like. We don't care that one box is on the left, one box is on the right. One of those boxes might not even exist in the context that we're looking at this data. Okay, what we can do is we can remove the user interface stuff both logically in our heads and say, well, that's now a completely separate thing, but physically as well. We could hand that off now to some young designer with a clever toolkit to go off and look, we'll say, look, we've got this data source, it's got a filter in it, it's got a list of items, and it will modify this thing called filtered items every now and again. Go off and design a user interface that looks nice and presents that to the user. But our code never cares about that. Our code now just looks generally like this. Rarely do we need to necessarily care about how things are laid out in the user interface. So, hopefully what I've shown you then is that we can bind to simple arrays. Okay, this thing called filter. We can bind to nested arrays. We saw that with a couple of things, Dyalog names and the filtered list thing. And we can bind a data source from a namespace as well, and we saw that with this thing called my source that I created. What we can't do at the moment is bind to higher rank arrays. Okay, clearly a lot of you will have data which is of higher rank, certainly of a matrix. And there are mechanisms of data binding that through things called a data view or a data table, but they are much more complicated than the simple cases that we've talked about here. So we're not in a position to demonstrate binding to matrices at the moment. But it's coming, we're working on it, we know how it should be done. And hopefully if I do some world tours with this, maybe you'll get to see that somewhere else later. So the key thing about this presentation is not what you can do with Dyalog APL as a language, but what Dyalog APL with data binding and WPF support can do for you, so that you have to do less. So, Morten didn't do any demos this morning. I'm now going to do that difficult juggling act of, I've got demo with one hand, I've got PowerPoint in the other hand, and you all know how that can go horribly wrong. So I'm going to tab now to my APL session. And I'm going to pull that trick that I regularly pull. I'm just going to sit here and repeatedly hit F12 until something interesting comes up on the session. Is that font okay, or do we need more? More? I don't want to go too big because I'll need to have the left-hand side over there and the right-hand side over here. Yeah. So I'm going to load my demonstration workspace. Okay, it's got quite a lot of stuff in it, and we'll see some of that later. Okay, I'm going to set my PW to something which is a bit more useful. So the first thing that I should point out, as is always the case with Dialogs.net support, we need to be using something. So the things that we use, the assemblies and the namespaces, are specified in quad using. And I've got here about, 6 or 7, 8 things that I've put in my list of items that I am currently quad using. So let's run this input with binding function, 3a. There was various iterations of this going through. But here's our user interface. And as I type A, N, we get the update of those items in the list that contain those letters. Now I have to go from memory a little bit. Let's just see. Okay, and just to prove that the data binding works, here I just have a simple appending a new value to the list of people that work for Dyalog names. We've rather bizarrely decided to take on someone called Wiley E. Coyote. But again, all we're doing here is we're making an assignment to a global variable in a namespace. We don't know anything about the user interface, but when we do that assignment, Wiley E. Coyote appears at the bottom of the list there. We don't care where that list box is. We don't even care that it exists or not. All we've done is assign to a global variable. One for the movie fans now. Let's add Kaiser Soze to our list of employees. Is he real? Is he not? Ooh. But anyway, real or not, he goes in the list. If we let's just look at the function that's doing that stuff. No, somebody asked that question yesterday. And of course, the way the trigger works, the trigger's only working off when the content of the text field changes. We could put a trigger on when the items changes and updates the other one as well, and it would just work in the same way. So here's the function that we actually ran there to do that, and it's, barring any typos on my part, exactly what we saw in the PowerPoint. And here's the callback that we're using, pretty much, hopefully exactly what was in the PowerPoint. It's just doing work on global variables. Doesn't care about the UI, doesn't care whether there's a UI or not. Now, let's look at some more complicated data. Now, I've been doing this 20 years. For 15 of those 20 years, there's only one set of data that I'm interested in. I have this workspace. It's a big workspace. It's full of information about most of the CDs that I own. I say most because I've not updated it in a while. At the moment, there are 2,401 CDs in the collection. I've not updated it for a bit. iTunes is beginning to annoy me. It changes. It never rips things where you want them to go. So I haven't done that rip thing, put it in iTunes and do that for a while. But let's look at the data a little bit. So we got 2,401 disks. Each of these disks has a display form. Let's look at the first 3 of those. First one is a thing called Images and Words. We've got some Toto. Again, you all know now this is the sort of stuff that I listen to. And we got this thing by Bobby Kimball there. But how the data is arranged is that each of these disks is a namespace. So we have a vector of 2,400 namespaces. Each of those namespaces has its own contents. For example, each disk has an artist in it, which is also a namespace. And that artist namespace has got a thing called full name, which is the name of the artist. And each disk has a title. So the third disk is called Rise Up and is by a guy called Bobby Kimball, ex-lead singer for Toto, if anyone actually cares. The third track, so each disk has got an array of tracks. Again, they're namespaces. Each of those namespaces has got a title and various other bits and pieces. So the title of the third track on the third album is that guy. This is how the data is laid out. And we can do normal APL stuff. Here I've got an entry in each of the tracks, which is a file name for where an MP3 is on the now world-traveled external disk. So, 2,401 disks. What I've got here then is a simple APL function called make. And what it does is it takes an argument, which is some XAML. And what it does is it actually also takes a left argument, which allows me to filter out some of my disks. Because there's a couple of cases where displaying 2,401 might not be the easiest thing to look at. It then reads some XAML using those 3 quad news that I showed you before. It then resizes the window because I've had to change my screen resolution since I set this thing up. And it shows the window and then sets the data context up to be a link to this array, this nested array that I said we could bind to, called sum. And sum is either all or some of the disks in the collection. Don't worry about that. There aren't 102 snippets here. We are going to look at a lot of XAML, but what I'm hoping to do is just, as Andy did really, don't worry about too much about what all of it is. I'm going to highlight the little bits as we change little bits as we build this thing up. So demo 1 is just a very simple bit of XAML. We have a window, so it's opened and closed at the top. We have inside that we have a stack panel of vertical arrangement. Inside that we have a grid which contains 3 rows. And all we have in here at the moment is just a single list box which I've given a name called My List. And by default, that ends up in row 0 of the grid. So if we run the make function on this guy, we get something that's got a list box in it, but we never set up any content. So, there's nothing to see here. Okay, now, yesterday I had the memory of a goldfish. I think today I have the memory of a small gnat. I have little entries in my F12 to tell me now would be a good time to go and look at some more PowerPoint. Okay, so here now, I'm just tweaking the XAML a little bit. What I've added, in my listbox definition, I've said that it's on grid row 0, just to be explicit about that. It's still called my list, but now I've set this item source property that we saw earlier when we were connecting to the filtered list, or the Dyalog names in the other example. And we're basically, by saying, putting a binding in there without a name following that, we're saying bind to the top level of the data context, which was that array called sum or called disks of namespaces. Okay, so let's come back to the APL. And now run demo 2. You can now see how this presentation is going to run on. So we make demo 2, and what we have now is we have a list box, and it's got stuff in it. Now the stuff that it has at the moment is actually very interesting, but it doesn't look very nice. It's just basically saying, look, up here there is a dialog.data.databound namespace, and then there are a number of those. And the size of the scroll bar sort of gives us an idea that maybe there's nearly 2,500 things in there. But if we come back to our session, I shall leave that about there. You know, we gave that list box the name, my name. So this little bit of code here says, given the window that we've got, dig out the item within it that's called my list, and then let's dig out the current value of this property called display member path. And currently, that's got nothing in it. But if we modify that, okay, and set it to something like title. Okay, so what we're saying is display the title member of all of those things that you know how to look at. So we do that, and we see that our list now changes to the title of each of those 2,500 disks that are in the collection. We can get cleverer than that. Let's say we want to display the artist for each of these disks. If you remember, I said that the artist was a namespace that had a number of members in it, and we see that it's gone back to that display form. But if we set it to artist.fullname, then we get the name mined, if you like, out of that data-bound nested array that we've been looking at. So here we see the artist that recorded each of those nearly 2,500 CDs. Right, back we go to the PowerPoint. Okay, but we've got this namespace here, and just displaying one item out of there is not particularly interesting. I mean, it's cool that we can do it, but we want to build up a richer interface. One of the things that we can do with a list box is that we can define a template for each of the items that appears in the list box. And by default, that would be the member path that we were setting before. But what I'm doing here then is I'm going to use the XAML to define the item template property of the list box. And an item template comprises of a thing called a data template, which is something that can have stuff in it. And the thing we're going to put in it is a stack panel, one of these vertical alignment containers, if you like. And inside our stack panel, we're going to put two text blocks. One with a font size of 22 that displays which is bound to the title. And this is going to be bound to the title of whatever item this template corresponds to in the list. And the second text box is bound to the full name of the artist, again, for whatever item in the list this template is being applied to. So let's come back to the APL, and now we run demo 5. And now what we can see in our list box is that each of our entries in the list box is comprised of two text blocks. One in a slightly larger font, which is the title, and then underneath we have the artist that recorded the thing. Okay, we've not written any APL code. All we're doing so far is extending our, it's a fairly static piece of XAML text. We are extending what our user interface is. We haven't changed what anything does yet. Now, I can't remember whether I'm PowerPoint. Yeah, okay, I'm PowerPointing again now. Okay, so here's the next chunk of stuff. What I'm going to do now is you remember I created a grid that had 3 rows in it, and I've used the top one for that list box. I'm now going to use the bottom row in the grid, and we'll come back to the middle row in a moment. But what I'm going to put, I can use my pointery thing, which is now red. So what I'm going to put in the third row, the bottom row of the grid, is a stack panel, something that aligns things vertically. And I've set up there that it's in grid row 2. And inside my stack panel, I'm going to have a wrap panel. So I'm building up this it's fairly simple once you get your head around it, but I appreciate the first time you see it, it's a little bit tricky. But basically, things are In a well-designed dialog box, things either line up vertically or line up horizontally. So I've got something which is going to line things up vertically, and inside that we have this horizontal arrangement of stuff. And that stuff is another list box. Okay, now this list box, a couple of properties here that I'm not going to go into, but the interesting thing here is that its item source now, remember we used the item source before to do binding, is now set to something. It's set to some binding, but it's not actually set to be bound to anything that's directly in our data source. What it's bound to is a property on the myList object. Now myList is the list at the top. So what we're saying is this list box is going to display the tracks of the selected item in the thing that's called myList. Okay, and this is a list box, and we're going to define an item template for this. And our template in here is actually going to be a grid, and it's going to be a grid with 4 columns. Okay, don't worry too much about this stuff on the end. If we have time at the end, we can come back to it. And I'm going to use 3 of these columns. They're in origin 0, so I'm going to use the last 3 columns. The first grid column is bound to the track number for the track that this list item corresponds to. The second column is going to contain the title of the track that has come from the selected item in the list box. And the third column is going to be the duration. How long is this track? And I've specified some margins here just to spread things out a little bit in that grid as it's displayed. So let's come now and see what that has done to our user interface. Okay. Now, initially, it's done nothing, because if you remember, that bottom list box was bound to the selected item of this top one, and at the moment, there isn't one. But if I select one of these guys, what we get at the bottom is that grid containing, okay, it's got 4 columns, but I've only used 3. If you remember, the track number was in the first column, the title was in the second, and the duration was in the third. And as I go through, clicking on changing the selected item in the list box at the top, then we get a new grid containing the new content auto-magically appearing underneath. And again, we haven't had to tell it to do that. We've just said, you know, this list box will contain the contents of the selected item. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. Okay, now I said when I created that second stack panel in the grid, I created the stack panel, then I created a wrap panel because I wanted to put 2 things horizontally next to each other. I want the list box on the left, and what I'm doing here is I'm now adding something called an image, which is actually defined at the bottom, so it's defined after the list box, but because we're aligning things horizontally, it's going to appear to the right of the list box. And it's an image with width 200 pixels, and it is bound to, again, something that's from the list box at the top. And it's bound to the cover image property, or the cover image variable in our workspace, of whatever the currently selected item is in that list box. Right, so there is our thing where we've added the cover image. Now I'm going to Alt-Tab back to the session, and I'm now going to run Demo 7. So what we see now, when I select an item, what we get at the bottom, because we have this horizontal arrangement, the data binding has dug out all the track names, all the durations, and it's also dug out the cover art for the selected item. Now, some of these don't have cover art, in which case I've picked a suitable default. Okay. Okay, so we'll skip a few steps here. What I'm just doing between 7 and 10 is just sort of tweaking the user, the way it looks, so that it looks a bit nicer. So demo 10 now. Okay, we've changed the foreground colors and the background colors. And what I've done is I have center aligned the wrap panel at the bottom. Okay, and I've also added a couple of labels up here so that we know what the track title and the artist is of the thing that we're currently looking at the bottom. And as we scroll through, all of that changes appropriately. So let's come back to the PowerPoint. Okay, right, so let's just pop back to that. So this is okay. you know, it sort of looks all right. The bottom part is sort of what we want. The top part, though, is a bit clunky. It's a bit ugly. It's not a great way of picking things out of stuff like that. Let's see if we can do something a little bit neater. And this is where these third-party controls and tools come in. Morton mentioned that we've struck this deal with the SyncFusion guys, where we now basically have secured you guys the right to secure the distribution for your application for some of these things. That wasn't a legal statement. For the legal statement, talk to the legal people. But you know, you have access to these things which you can use in your applications and ship them. Okay. So I was looking through some of the SyncFusion demos that come through, and Chad later is going to show you some of these too. But what you get with the SyncFusion tools is you get a nice dashboard, which is a thing that talks you through their documentation, some of their samples. If we click the Run Samples button, okay, there's an application here that we can scroll through, and we can actually click our way through this and look at samples, including C# code if necessary, and XAML code to show how to build up some of their controls and how you use them and the sorts of things that you can do. So I was, you know, strolling through these sorts of things. And what they've got in here is they've got this thing called a carousel control. So you can click on that and just play the demo, and it compiles it and it runs it up. And what this gives you, it gives you a sort of spinny thing displaying pictures of, in this case, it's employees in a presumably fake company. I don't know. They may be real people. But you can click on one of these and it scrolls around and you can see what's going on. So this is something that, you know, maybe we can sort of make use of. So let's see how we might actually make use of that from our data-bound example. Oh, no, don't close that. Close that. Okay, so remember, in my list box at the top of my grid contained a list box that just displayed the title and the full name of the artist for the selected item. Let's rip that out. Throw it away. Don't want that anymore. We want to do something better. We want to make use of the SyncFusion carousel control. Now, we need to do a couple of things. One is right at the top of our XAML, where we had those declarations that told the .NET framework where to look for each of the components. We need to add an element to tell it, look, when I reference something that's prefixed by the phrase SF:, as I'm doing here, what that actually is a reference to this namespace called syncfusion.windows.shared, which is in this assembly called syncfusion.shared. And then, once I've got that tag defined at the top, I can insert elements from that namespace in my XAML. So I'm going to create an instance of the carousel. Okay, I'm not going to do anything. My interface now contains on row 0 an instance of the carousel control. I'm going to call it my list exactly as I called it before. I'm going to give it a width and a height. And I'm going to set its foreground color to that yellow. And this is that little bit of stuff that we skipped through earlier. Okay, and its item source is binding. So it's going to bind to the top level of the data source exactly as our list box did before. There. Okay, so let's run this guy. Now, here's one of the cases where I'm going to give a left-hand argument to the function called make because I don't want it to go crazy. But if we run this guy, what we get now... Oh, I've missed a step, have I? Okay, I've missed a step. What I've done here, in the same way with the caret that we could set an item template with the list box, you can set an item template for how things appear in the carousel control. And in this example, I've just taken exactly the one that I had before. Before, these appeared as vertically in the rows in a list box. Now they appear in that circular arrangement that we saw with the carousel control. But apart from that, it works the same way. I can click on one of these, and this stuff down at the bottom is still bound to the selected item of the thing at the top. So it all works the same. We just changed again, without needing to rewrite any new APL code, how things look. Okay. So I think I missed a bit of PowerPoint here. So there's our definition. There. Okay, no, I missed a step. So that was this this PowerPoint, this XAML is missing a bit. It's missing that data template definition that I showed you before. Something's gone out of sync and I missed it this morning. Okay, but what we're going to do now then is we're going to take out that 2 text block arrangement for our item template for our carousel, and we're going to replace it with an image, the cover image. So we're bound now to the cover image of the item corresponding to the element in that array for this item in the carousel. And now we get something that looks like that. Okay? And it works exactly the same way that it worked before. All we've done is change the visuals a little bit. Okay? Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Now, these SyncFusion guys, they're a pretty clever bunch of dudes. They think of everything. We don't necessarily want our things to be going around in a circle like that. We want to provide maybe a custom path. We don't want it to do that. We want it to do something different. And what you can actually do with the SyncFusion carousel is you can specify a visual mode and say this visual mode is a custom path. Okay? Rather than the circle, something else. And so what we can do in our XAML is we can specify the path property of our carousel control to be, and I learned yesterday, this is an SVG statement, I believe. So it prescribes a line or a path in SVG terms. Okay, oh, and the other thing that I've done in here, which I think was on the previous sheet, oh yeah, was I've just specified now, we don't want to see all of the disks, we don't want to see 15, we specified that we just want to see 10 at a time. Okay, so if we run this fellow, and now I'm just going to show all of the disks because the carousel now is going to paginate them and show them to us 10 at a time. But because we've set that custom path, rather than these things going around in a circle, they actually scroll in left to right as I click on them. And again, I've not had to write any APL code to handle any of this. It's all being done with the underlying controls, the WPF, and the data binding. Okay. Okay, right, so originally then our data template for each of our elements in our carousel just contained the cover art. Okay, but we can do better than that. Let's put our image in a stack panel, a vertical arrangement of stuff. Okay, what I'm going to do under that image is I'm going to create an instance of a thing called a border. And it's got properties, but we needn't worry too much about those at the moment. Okay, but one of the cool properties that a border has is it allows you to set its background to be a visual brush corresponding to an element that already exists somewhere in the page or on the form. So, for example, here, this is saying the background for this border is going to be whatever is currently in the image element. Okay, so as this stands, we're going to have our image at the top. We're going to have a border which also contains the same image. Okay, but the border is cool. Border object's cool because we can apply a transformation to it. Okay, so rather than just putting the image underneath it and duplicating it up, we can actually scale it in the y direction by neg1, which is going to flip it upside down. Okay. In addition, on the border, we can specify an opacity mask, something to do with transparency. And what we can say is, we won't go into the details too much here because I frankly don't understand them. I just yanked this from an example online, which is easy to do with XAML because XAML is XAML. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it in C# or whether you're doing it in APL. If it works in one, it'll work in the other. But what this does is it defines a brush that's transparency changes as you go top to bottom in the brush. Okay, so if we look at this now, what we get is we get that mirroring effect. If you remember, we have the image underneath, which we flip round, and then we apply this transparency to it. So we get this thing that looks like we've got our cover art, on a glass table because it's reflected underneath. And all the scaling that's going on, where these things are getting smaller as we go, to the edges, that's all done by the carousel control. That's all done as part of that custom path thing that we did. And of course, this still works exactly the same as it ever did. Again, we've not written any more APL code. We've written some XAML code, if I have to say that. But we've just changed what our interface looks like. Okay, how are we doing for time? 10 minutes. Okay, we're just probably doing all right. Okay, so this is what we said was this is data bound stuff. So far we've been drilling into the data and displaying it in a user interface. But here, for example, we've got an album by a dude called, oh no. No, there was a gag here, and it's not going to work because I haven't reset it since I did this yesterday. We'll do the gag backwards. Okay. The gag yesterday, oh no, all right, no, let's do it backwards. Track number 1 is called Woodstock. I'm pretty sure that there wasn't a track, well, there wasn't a big song in the 70s called Woodstock, was it? It was called Woodstook, wasn't it? It was called Woodstook? Yeah, and that's what it was called. Okay, so something's wrong with our data. Let's fix our data. Okay. Let's not do that. Let's not do that. We know that, and we could dig this. In fact, here we could do that there. What we can do is we can dig out the namespace that's currently selected in the list box and do a dyadic iota to look up its position within our disks array. Okay, and it tells us that it's disks 3. So disks 3 has got a number of tracks, each of which has got a title, and we can display those. Okay. Now, so disks, oh dear, disks 3 dot tracks 1 dot title is Woodstock. It's not called Woodstock. It wasn't just me. It was Woodstook, wasn't it? You're getting this? I'm doing this backwards. It's very weird. So we'll fix this. Look, we'll change my data because my data's clearly wrong, and we've noticed that because we've been looking at the Woodstook. Now I can even remember how it goes. Right, okay, so let's do that. Now, watch this. It's bound, right? The data is bound to the user interface. It says Woodstock up there. That's not right. It says Woodstook over here. If we do that, you'll see that changed now. Hopefully you'll see that. That now says Woodstook. Okay, our data is bound. We can dig into our data in the APL workspace. Any changes that we make are reflected in the user interface that are bound to it. Gag number 2 now, which isn't going to work because I haven't reset this from yesterday. It's got an apostrophe in it. You've doesn't have an apostrophe in it. That's not good English, is it? And oh, we'll just do that one. This gag's going to get very tired very soon. Let's regenerate our user interface. Oh, no, we'll not do that. Okay, now in my user interface, here's the same thing. But instead of having text blocks down here, I've put in editable text fields. And I've set up the binding so that it's two-way. So now, if I click on this badly punctuated, "You've got a friend," doesn't it drive you crazy? We can take the apostrophe out. Okay. Come back now and look at our data. And we can see that our incorrect apostrophe has been taken out. Let's do that again. Let's now run the gag in the right direction. Let's change it. Let's put the apostrophe in. Okay. Let's look at the data again. And our apostrophes come back in again. So if we choose to do so, our data binding can work in 2 directions. We can make changes to the data, which is affected in the user interface. And we can make changes in the user interface. And if we choose to do so, they can be reflected in the data. Okay. Okay, so that's all the same gags. Right, so let's shoot back to the PowerPoint. How are we doing? 8 minutes plus questions. Okay, let's see where we're at. Okay, right, so all very well and good as it stands. We can look at our stuff. No one wants to look at music. Who looks at music? You want to play music. So what we'll do in our XAML now, we'll set up at the top. We'll set up 2 bitmap image objects. One is associated with a file called play.png, and one is associated with a file called pause.png. And down here, what we'll do in our grid that had the list of tracks in, we're now going to use the first column, the 0th column, and we're going to put an image in there, which the source for which comes from one of these resources. And initially, we're going to set it to be the play image. Okay. In addition, okay, in my XAML towards the top, I'm going to create, or I'm going to have an instance of a media element object. Standard part of the WPF framework. I'm going to give it a name called media. It has 0 height because I don't particularly want to see it. Okay, but it's there in the XAML. And then one last little trick at the bottom here, which I'm sure I don't need, but I couldn't figure out any other way of doing it. We have an invisible text block at the bottom that's content, its text field, is bound to the file name for the particular track. You remember at the beginning I said there was each track had a file name property that was where the MP3 was. So this is just a way of putting that entry into something that I can easily dig it out of later. So if we run, right. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to run a slightly different version of make, which hooks up an event on clicks on that image. Now it's not very pretty because there's another I-beam in there that we needed to put in for WPF for version 14. So it's just an extra couple of lines of code, but forgive me if I don't show you that, because then I'd have to take a couple of minutes to describe it. So make with event now, demo 17. So here's our stuff. Now there's our play buttons, and we can click on one of these things. Okay, and there is our wood stook coming out loud and clear. And of course we can navigate through. Okay. And because we can click on anything else and play something else as well. Oh, well, it's jazz piano, it's going to be quiet, isn't it? Any AOR fans in the room? So we can click through. Whenever we click that button, it's associated with the selected item in that track, which is associated with the selected item in the albums, and so on and so forth. Let me kill that and just show you what was in that player callback, player CB. This is the function now. Now we're talking about stuff that does stuff. When the button is clicked on, we want to do something. And what we're saying here is this is a function that has to have a signature that matches what the .NET framework works. But what we get is we get some arguments that tells us precisely which image object was clicked on. We need to check that it was one called play because there are other images in the window and we want to make sure we only act on the correct one. Okay. We then find our media player using the find name function, which I touched on earlier. We then dig out from that invisible field what its text was. So that's essentially digging out the file name, using data binding to having set that up. We set that to be the source of our media player, and then we just hit the play button. Okay, and it plays the tune, and magic happens. And we've written, what's that, 8 lines of APL code, plus the stuff that reads the XAML. But this is it. As far as the specifics of this application is concerned, we've set up some data binding. That's going to be the same regardless of what you're doing. This is the only bit that we have in here that does something. Okay, we've done that. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. I think we're on the last couple of slides now, which isn't bad. So, right, okay, so what we've got now is we've got a bit of a mismatch now. We've got some functional code that we need to run. We've got some OOE stuff. We're creating instances of this window and stuff. What would be cool, I'm hoping, is if we combine these things together. Let's define a class in APL that loads its XAML and includes a callback for that play functionality. So here we have some APL code. I don't know how easy it is to read. Okay, it's not too bad from here. You guys at the back may struggle a little bit. So what we have here is we have our own class, which I've rather humorously, I think you'll find, called MyTunes. Okay, it was the best gag in the thing, never mind. Which derives from a class called Window. Okay, it has this play function in it, which has grown a little bit since the first one we saw, because this is going to deal with changing images that look like play buttons to images that look like pause buttons. So it's got some logic about what was the last thing we clicked on, so that if we hit play on someone else, it'll flip it back again. And then at the top, it's got a constructor, one of these functions that gets called whenever an instance of a thing is created. And what the constructor for MyTunes does is that it uses this expression that we saw before to load some XAML, just to load its content dynamically. It sets its position inside, it shows itself, it sets up its data context, and it adds this uses this nasty bit of code to add a event handler onto the click on the image. And it sets its title at the end. Oh, look. I was saying, look, here are the things that, oh, okay, and here are the other things that it does. It's got within it embedded the code that we saw in the earlier callback to play the media. Okay, now another little bit of stuff here that we currently have to do with version 14 that I'm hoping to get away from. Because all of this stuff is tightly bound with the .NET framework, we need to have that MyTunes class defined in an assembly so that the .NET stuff has got some metadata that it can hook onto to find out about that play function and various other bits and pieces. Now, generally, if you want to do this, you write the thing out as a dynamic library and then quad use it either in this application or in something else. But what we've had in APL for many years is this export to memory thing. And you may have seen that if you've done any .NET work. And what that does, it creates an in-process, in-memory assembly. And I can just do that now with a little IBeam. And that just creates the metadata for that myClass thing. But now what I can do, I have a class called MyTunes that knows how to instantiate itself, knows how to display all of that content. It's about 30 or something lines of code. It knows how to play and pause tracks. So all I need to type in my session is quad new MyTunes. And what we get is the interface that we've been looking at all day. Now, I don't know if you've got smart eyes, you might see this. That's now changed to a pause button there. And if I click on something else, that other pause button would have changed to a play button, and now this one has carried on like that. So hopefully, what I've shown you then is with a good combination of XAML and APL code, we can build this rich user interface to display our data-bound data. Here is all of the XAML we've looked at this afternoon. There's about 90 lines of it. I've pretty much explained what every line in the XAML here does. And here is our APL source code for the MyTunes class. It's pretty much split into two parts. The play function at the bottom is just dealing with the manipulation of the images on the buttons, and the code at the top is loading the XAML and setting up the data binding. And we have 92 lines of XAML. Now this XAML code, of course, isn't really doing anything. It's just specifying what our interface is, what it looks like. The APL code is the part of this which is actually doing the work. And most of that work is done in the 19 lines that play the track. So there you have it. You have XAML, Dyalog APL, data binding, building this alternative to iTunes for those of us that like to do things ourselves. Thank you very much.